Welcome to World of Sleepcraft. Tonight we trace the complete story of Xal'atath, the Harbinger of the Void, from her mysterious origins in the primordial darkness to her rise as the central villain of the Worldsoul Saga. The tale we tell tonight is one of patience beyond mortal comprehension. It is the story of a being who has waited longer than empires, who has schemed longer than civilizations, who has watched the rise and fall of gods with the detachment of one who knows that time itself is on her side. It is the story of Xal'atath, and to understand her, we must first understand the darkness from which she came. In the vast emptiness that exists beyond the known cosmos, in the spaces between realities where neither light nor matter can survive, there dwell entities of pure darkness. These are the Void Lords, beings of such immense power and alien nature that even the mighty Titans fear their influence. The Void Lords cannot exist in the physical universe as we know it. Their very presence would unravel the fabric of reality, dissolving matter and energy alike into the endless nothing from which they came. And yet, they hunger. They hunger for creation itself, seeking to unmake all that exists and draw it back into the primordial void. The void is not simply darkness or absence. It is a fundamental force of the cosmos, one of the 6 great powers that shape all of existence. Light and shadow, order and disorder, life and death. These cosmic forces have been at war since before time had meaning, their conflicts shaping the very nature of reality itself. The Void Lords represent shadow at its most extreme, beings of such pure darkness that they exist outside of creation entirely, looking in with hungry eyes and hungrier thoughts. From the void come the whispers that drive mortals mad, the shadows that move when nothing casts them, the dreams that leave sleepers screaming in the night. The Void Lords send their influence, seeping through the cracks, in reality corrupting whatever they touch, twisting life and order into chaos and madness. Planets that fall to their influence become nightmare realms, where the very laws of physics break down, where up becomes down, and thought becomes form, and nothing is as it should be. To accomplish their goals, the Void Lords must work through intermediaries. They cannot touch the physical universe directly, but they can send their influence through rifts in reality, can whisper through the spaces between dimensions, can create servants to do their bidding in the worlds of light and matter. The most powerful of these servants are the old gods, mountains of flesh and shadow that the Void Lords hurl across the cosmos like seeds, hoping that one will land on a world with a nascent titan sleeping in its core. It is from this cosmic backdrop of darkness and hunger that Xal'atath emerges, though her true origins remain shrouded in mystery even after all these ages. She is connected to the void in ways that even she may not fully understand, a being whose existence predates many of the great powers that now struggle for control of creation. The nature of Xal'atath has been debated by scholars, mad cultists, and ancient beings alike. Some believe she was created by the Void Lords themselves, a harbinger sent ahead to prepare worlds for consumption. Others theorize that she was once something else entirely, a 5th old god who was consumed or partially destroyed by her kin in the early days of creation. The truth, as with all things touched by the void, is difficult to pin down, shifting and changing depending on who tells the tale and what they wish to believe. What we do know is that Xal'atath is ancient, beyond mortal reckoning. She existed before the ordering of Azeroth, before the Titans came to shape the world, before the great empires of flesh and stone rose and fell across the cosmos. She has seen civilizations bloom and wither across countless worlds, has watched as the great forces of creation battled for supremacy, has waited with infinite patience for her moment to claim what she believes is rightfully hers. Unlike the old gods, who crashed into Azeroth and immediately began corrupting the nascent world soul, Xal'atath appears to have had a different purpose. She served as a harbinger, a herald who goes before the greater darkness to prepare the way. In this role, she is similar to the Silver Surfer of mortal comic books, a servant who scouts ahead for a world-devouring master. But where that fictional herald eventually rebelled against his master out of compassion for the worlds he helped destroy, Xal'atath's motivations were entirely different. She had no compassion, no remorse, no concern for the civilizations that fell to her master's hunger. Her rebellion, when it came, was purely selfish. She rebelled not because she cared about the worlds being consumed, but because she wanted to consume them herself. She served Demensius not out of loyalty or fear, but because serving him gave her access to power and knowledge she could not have obtained alone. When she finally betrayed him, it was not a moral awakening, but a calculated move to advance her own position. The being she served most directly was Demensius the All-Devouring, one of the legendary Void Lords whose hunger knew no bounds. Demensius was a terror that spanned galaxies, a being whose very approach sent civilizations into panic, whose shadow blotted out stars. He consumed entire worlds, drawing their essence into himself and growing ever more powerful with each reality he unmade. The planets he devoured did not simply die. They ceased to exist entirely, their matter and energy absorbed into Demensius's ever-growing form, their histories and cultures erased from the cosmos as though they had never been. Xal'atath served as his harbinger, the herald who traveled ahead to ensure that each world fell quickly when Demensius arrived. She would arrive on a target world years or decades before her master, would infiltrate its societies, would learn its weaknesses. She spread discord and despair among the populations, set factions against each other, corrupted leaders and generals, weakened the very foundations of civilization. By the time Demensius arrived, the world was already broken, its defenders scattered, its hope extinguished. The feast would be swift and complete. In her role as harbinger, Xal'atath witnessed the consumption of countless worlds. She saw civilizations far older and more advanced than anything Azeroth would ever produce, watched as their monuments crumbled and their people screamed and their very reality was unmade. She felt no pity for them. They were merely resources, energy to be harvested, stepping stones on the path to power. But Xal'atath was never truly loyal to anyone but herself. Even as she served Demensius faithfully, even as she prepared world after world for his consumption, she was looking for ways to break free from his service. She studied the Void Lord's weaknesses, analyzed his patterns, searched for opportunities that might allow her to claim power for herself rather than simply delivering it to her master. This pattern of service and betrayal would define her existence across the ages, a constant cycle of seeming allegiance followed by inevitable treachery. She learned early that power flows to those patient enough to wait and cunning enough to strike at the perfect moment. Every master she served was simply another teacher, another source of knowledge and power that she would eventually take for herself. Her time as Demensius's Harbinger took her to many worlds, but the one that would prove most significant was Ka'arish, home to the ethereal beings who would later become known as the Brokers and the Void Ethereals. Ka'arish was a world of brilliant scholars and artisans, a civilization that had achieved great heights of knowledge and culture. When Demensius set his hungry gaze upon it, Xal'atath went ahead to prepare the way. What happened on Ka'arish would shape the course of Xal'atath's existence for millennia to come. She manipulated events, sowed discord, and prepared the world for her master's arrival. But she also saw an opportunity. Working with certain Ka'arishi scholars, including the being who would later be known as Locus-walker, she plotted a betrayal that would free her from Demensius's service forever. The details of this conspiracy would remain hidden for thousands of years, known only to those who had been there, kept as a secret that would one day return to haunt them all. Ka'arish was not like the primitive worlds Xal'atath had helped consume before. Its people had developed sophisticated magic and technology, had built cities of crystalline beauty, had achieved a level of civilization that rivaled anything she had encountered. The Ka'arishi were not simple victims waiting to be devoured. They were scholars, researchers, beings who sought to understand the cosmos in all its complexity. When Xal'atath arrived to prepare the way for Demensius, she found the Ka'arishi already aware of the threat they faced. Their seers had glimpsed the coming darkness. Their researchers had studied the void and knew what approached. Unlike other worlds she had visited, Ka'arish would not fall quietly. Locus-walker was among the foremost researchers of the void on Ka'arish. He and his colleagues had developed theories about how void energy worked, had created technologies that could harness it, had even found ways to resist its corrupting influence. When Xal'atath approached him, not as an enemy, but as a potential ally, he listened. The proposition was simple. Demensius would consume Ka'arish, regardless of what the Ka'arishi did. Nothing could stop a Void Lord at the height of his power. But there was a chance, a slim chance, to turn Ka'arish's destruction into a weapon against Demensius himself. The planet's death throes could be channeled, focused, turned into a blow that would severely wound the All-Devouring. Xal'atath would help them with this plan. In exchange, she wanted only one thing: her freedom from Demensius's service. The ritual that would wound the Void Lord would also sever her connection to him, would break the bonds that made her his harbinger and subject to his will. Locus-walker agreed, though he had no illusions about Xal'atath's motives. He knew she was using them just as much as they were using her. But what choice did they have? Ka'arish was doomed either way. At least this way, some of his people might survive, and the monster who consumed their world would be wounded. The plan required the Reshi ribbons, ancient Ka'arishi relics that could bind and channel enormous amounts of energy. These ribbons were sacred objects used in their most important ceremonies and rituals. Now they would be turned into weapons of planetary destruction. When Demensius arrived, he found Ka'arish already dying. The Ka'arishi had triggered their own apocalypse, channeling the planet's very essence through the Reshi ribbons and directing it at the Void Lord. The energy that should have fed Demensius was instead used against him, tearing at his essence, dealing wounds that would take millennia to heal. Ka'arish was destroyed, But Demensius did not consume it. The survivors were transformed by the energies released, becoming the ethereal beings they are today. Beings of pure energy bound in wrappings and constructs, forever changed by the destruction of their home. But they survived, and Demensius was forced to retreat, weakened beyond anything he had experienced in ages. And Xal'atath was free. The bonds that had tied her to her master were broken in the ritual's aftermath. She was no longer the harbinger of Demensius, no longer subject to his will, no longer required to prepare worlds for his consumption. She could pursue her own goals at last. But freedom came with enemies. Demensius, once he recovered enough to think clearly, would certainly seek revenge. The Ka'areshi survivors knew what she truly was and what she had helped them do, and the forces of the cosmos did not look kindly on traitors. Xal'atath needed to disappear, to find a place to hide and rebuild her power, and she knew exactly where to go. Azeroth, a world already claimed by the old gods, would provide perfect cover. Its darkness would hide her own, and its powerful world soul offered opportunities that she could not resist exploring. When Xal'atath first came to Azeroth, she found a world already claimed by others like herself. The old gods had crashed into the nascent planet eons ago, sent by the Void Lords like spores across the cosmos, each one seeking to find and corrupt a nascent world soul before the Titans could discover and nurture it. They had sent their corrupting influence deep into the world's crust, burrowing like parasites into the very flesh of the planet, seeking to corrupt the powerful world soul that slumbered at Azeroth's core. 4 great entities had established their dominion over this world. Sithun claimed the deserts of the south, establishing his realm of nightmares in what would later become Silithus and Ankiraj. His 1,000 eyes gazed upon all who entered his domain, and his whispers drove even the strongest minds to madness. Yogg-Saron took the frozen north as his territory, the beast with 1,000 maws whose very presence corrupted the Titan forged, who would later be tasked with guarding his prison. And Zoth lurked in the deep places beneath the sea, the most cunning and patient of the old gods, always scheming, always planning, his tentacles reaching into dreams and nightmares alike. And then there was Y'Sharj, the greatest of them all. 7 heads rose from his mountainous form, each one representing a different aspect of darkness and corruption. His influence spread across what would later become the continent of Pandaria, his malevolence so profound that even his death would leave a scar on the world that would persist for tens of thousands of years. The Shah, manifestations of negative emotions that would plague Pandaria until modern times, were the final gift of Y'Sharj to a world he could no longer directly torment. These old gods had built the Black Empire, a nightmare realm of shadow and madness that covered the face of Azeroth. Their servants spread across the world in countless millions. The faceless Naraki served as their generals and priests, beings whose very appearance could shatter mortal sanity, whose whispers carried the will of their masters to every corner of the empire. The insectoid Akir formed the backbone of their armies, vast swarms of chitinous warriors that constructed citadels and temple cities dedicated to the worship of their dark masters. The Black Empire was a time of absolute horror, when the very fabric of reality bent to the will of beings whose thoughts could shatter mortal minds. The sun was blocked by clouds of living darkness. The seas churned with nameless horrors. Mountains walked, and cities screamed, and the line between nightmare and reality ceased to have meaning. For untold ages, the old gods ruled absolutely, their power unchallenged, their corruption spreading deeper and deeper into Azeroth's wounded world soul. Xal'atath observed this empire with a mixture of admiration and resentment. She recognized the power the old gods had accumulated, understood the threat they posed to all other void entities who might seek to claim Azeroth's world soul for themselves. She also saw opportunity. The old gods were powerful, but they were also divided. Each one sought supremacy over the others, their alliance one of convenience rather than true cooperation. This division, Xal'atath believed, could be exploited. She established herself on Azeroth, building her own power base while carefully avoiding direct confrontation with the established old gods. She gathered followers, corrupted beings who served her rather than the other four, built her own small empire within the shadows of the greater darkness. For ages, she watched and waited, studying her rivals, learning their weaknesses, preparing for the moment when she could strike. That moment came when N'Zoth completed construction of Ny'alotha, the great nightmare city that existed simultaneously in the waking world and the realm of dreams. Ny'alotha was N'Zoth's masterwork, a monument to the power of the deep god, a place where reality and unreality merged into something terrifying and beautiful. Its completion represented a significant increase in N'Zoth's power, threatening to upset the delicate balance between the old gods. Xal'atath saw her opportunity and seized it. She launched a surprise attack against N'Zoth, leading her forces against the Nightmare City in an assault that caught the deep god off guard. For a brief moment, it seemed as though she might succeed. Her forces penetrated Ny'alotha's defenses, threatening to claim the city and its power for themselves. But N'Zoth was not without allies. Recognizing the threat Xal'atath posed to all of them, he called upon C'Thun, Y'Sharj, and Yogg-Saron for reinforcements. The four old gods, rivals who had spent eons plotting against each other, united against this common enemy. Their combined power was overwhelming. Xal'atath's forces were swept aside, her assault broken, her ambitions seemingly crushed. The old gods could have destroyed her entirely. They certainly had the power to unmake her, to scatter her essence across the void until nothing remained. But destruction was not their way. The old gods understood patience, understood that even defeated enemies could be useful tools. And so they devised a punishment that was both imprisonment and humiliation. They bound Xal'atath's essence into a dagger, a sacrificial blade that had been used in the darkest rituals of the Black Empire. This blade, which would come to be known as Xal'atath, Blade of the Black Empire, would become her prison for millennia to come. Her consciousness remained intact, able to think and observe and even communicate, but she could not act on her own. She could only watch as the world changed around her, as the old gods she had tried to overthrow continued their reign. Y'Sharj, the most powerful of the old gods, took particular pleasure in taunting her. He told her that she would only be able to spectate as Azeroth gained untold powers, never able to lay claim to it herself. She would watch as the Black Empire flourished, watch as the world soul was corrupted, watch as everything she had hoped to achieve was accomplished by others. But Xal'atath, even in defeat, remained defiant. She told Y'Sharj that this game had only just begun, that she had an eternity to play. She would wait. She would watch, and when the moment was right, she would have her revenge on those who had imprisoned her. The Black Empire would not last forever. The Titans, those great beings of order who traveled the cosmos shaping worlds and nurturing world souls, eventually turned their attention to Azeroth. They came in their great machines, beings of metal and order whose very presence pushed back the corruption of the void. They saw the old gods burrowing into the planet like parasites, recognized the threat they posed to the nascent Titan sleeping within Azeroth's core, and decided that action must be taken. The Titans understood what Azeroth could become. The world soul slumbering within the planet's core was potentially the most powerful Titan ever born, a being whose awakening could reshape the balance of power across the entire cosmos. If the old gods succeeded in corrupting this world soul before it could awaken, if they twisted it into something dark and terrible, the result would be a void titan, a being of such power that nothing in creation could stand against it. The Void Lord's ultimate victory would be assured. This could not be allowed. The Titans sent their armies, the Titan forged, to battle the forces of the Black Empire. These were constructs of stone and metal, imbued with the power of the Titans themselves, immune to the whispers that drove mortal minds to madness. They came in their thousands and their tens of thousands, led by the mighty keepers who had been crafted to serve as Azeroth's guardians. Great wars were fought across the face of Azeroth, conflicts that reshaped continents and sundered mountain ranges. The Akir were driven back, their hive cities burned, their endless swarms cut down by weapons of pure order. The faceless ones were slaughtered in their millions, their twisted forms falling before the light of the Titans. And the citadels of the old gods were cast down one by one, their nightmare spires toppled, their temples of madness reduced to rubble. But the old gods themselves were another matter. They had burrowed too deeply into Azeroth's flesh, had wrapped their tentacles too thoroughly around the world soul. When the Titan Forged attempted to destroy them directly, they found that the old gods had become part of the planet itself, as integral to Azeroth as its mountains or its seas. When the Titan Forged could not defeat Y'Sharj through conventional means, the Titan Aman'Thul himself reached down from the heavens and tore the greatest of the old gods from Azeroth's surface. His hand, larger than continents, closed around Y'Sharj's seven-headed form and ripped it free from the world. This act killed Y'Sharj, ended the greatest of the old gods forever. But it also tore a wound in Azeroth's surface, a gaping hole that reached down to the world soul itself. The planet's lifeblood, which would later be called the Well of Eternity, began to bleed through this wound, arcane energy of unimaginable power pooling on the surface where Y'Sharj had once stood. The Titans realized with horror what they had done. In destroying one old god, they had nearly killed the very world soul they were trying to protect. They could not simply destroy the remaining old gods without risking fatal damage to Azeroth. The corruption had spread too far. S'thun, Yogg-Saron, and N'Zoth would have to remain, but they could be contained. Instead of destruction, the Titans chose imprisonment. They bound the three remaining old gods deep beneath the surface of the world, using chains of Titan-forged construction, magical wards that would hold for eternity, prisons from which there could be no escape. Through all of this, the blade of the Black Empire remained free. Unlike the old gods themselves, The dagger containing Xal'atath's essence was not specifically targeted by the Titans. Perhaps they did not recognize the threat it represented. Perhaps they believed that with the old gods imprisoned, a mere artifact was no danger. Whatever the reason, Xal'atath avoided imprisonment, though she remained bound within her blade. In the ages that followed the fall of the Black Empire, the dagger passed through many hands. Cults of those who still worshipped the old gods kept it hidden, using it in dark rituals, never realizing the true nature of the entity trapped within. The blade surfaced from time to time throughout history, and wherever it appeared, disaster inevitably followed. One of the earliest recorded instances of the blade's influence came during the Age of the Trolls. In those ancient times, the great Sundalari Empire and its offshoots dominated much of Azeroth. The Trolls had risen to power in the aftermath of the Black Empire's fall, filling the vacuum left by the defeated old gods. They had established themselves as one of the most powerful civilizations on the planet, their empires spanning continents, their priests wielding power that rivaled even the fallen servants of darkness. The Zandalari sat atop the troll hierarchy, their golden empire centered on the mountain of Zuldazar. From this seat of power, they guided and influenced the other troll tribes, the Gurubashi in the south, the Amani in the forests to the north, the Drakari in the frozen wastes. For thousands of years, the trolls had ruled unchallenged, their civilization reaching heights that would not be matched until the rise of the Night Elves. It was during this golden age that the blade came into the possession of Zando, an ambitious Gurubashi witch doctor who had once stood among the most respected priests of his tribe. He had served faithfully for decades, had performed the rituals and sacrifices that kept the Loa pleased, had guided his people through times of hardship and plenty alike. But the politics of the Gurubashi court were treacherous, and Zando had made enemies among those who coveted his position. Through lies and manipulation, his rivals had turned the tribal council against him. They accused him of heresy, of performing forbidden rituals, of trafficking with dark powers. The accusations were false, but by the time the truth could be established, Zando had already been stripped of his rank and exiled from the tribe he had served his entire life. He left the great temple of Zul'Gurub with nothing but the clothes on his back and a burning hatred in his heart. Zando wandered the jungles of Stranglethorn for months, surviving on roots and whatever prey he could catch. His hatred grew with each passing day, festering in his heart like a wound that would not heal. He dreamed of revenge, of returning to Zul'Gurub with an army at his back, of making those who had wronged him pay for their betrayal. But he was just one troll, alone and powerless. What could he do against an entire empire? The blade found him in the depths of the jungle, half buried in the mud of a swamp that had swallowed some forgotten ruin from the age of the Black Empire. Zando had not been looking for it. He had simply stumbled upon it, drawn by a whisper that seemed to call his name from the shadows. When he pulled the dagger from the earth, he felt power surge through him, and a voice spoke in his mind for the first time. Xal'atath recognized in Zando everything she needed in a pawn: his anger, his resentment, his hunger for revenge. These were the handles by which she could control him. She did not reveal herself immediately. Instead, she fed his hatred, whispered encouragement in the dark hours of the night, guided his thoughts toward increasingly dark paths. She promised power. She promised revenge. She promised everything his bitter heart desired. Under Xal'atath's guidance, Xando traveled to the resting place of Kithix, one of the great Sithraxi generals who had served the old gods during the age of the Black Empire. The Sithraxi were the commanders of the Akir, massive insectoid creatures of tremendous power who had led the swarms against the Titan forged during the Great Wars of Ordering. Most had been destroyed during those conflicts, but a few had survived, falling into torpor rather than true death, waiting for someone or something to awaken them. Kithix lay dormant beneath the earth, not quite dead but not truly alive. Its massive form, encased in chitin harder than steel, had lain undisturbed for tens of thousands of years. The creature's dreams reached out into the world, calling to the scattered Akir who still survived in hidden colonies, waiting for the moment when their master would rise again. Xando made blood offerings at the site, dark rituals that Xal'atath taught him. He sacrificed prisoners he had captured, fellow trolls he had ambushed on the jungle paths, their life force flowing into the ancient Sithraxi general. Each sacrifice weakened the bonds that held Kithix in slumber. Each death brought the awakening closer. When Kithix finally rose, the ground itself trembled. The Sithraxi general burst from its ancient tomb, scattering earth and stone in all directions. Its 1,000 eyes surveyed a world that had changed beyond recognition during its long sleep, but its purpose remained unchanged. The old gods might be imprisoned, but their servants still had work to do. Kithix immediately began to rally the scattered Akir, sending out psychic calls that resonated with colonies hidden across the continent. For millennia, the Akir had survived in the shadows, waiting for this moment. Now their master had returned, and they would reclaim the world that had been stolen from them. Under Kithix's leadership, the Akir launched a massive war against the troll empires. The conflict that followed was devastating, a war that would reshape the face of Kalimdor and birth new civilizations from the ashes of the old. The trolls, for all their power, found themselves facing an enemy that multiplied faster than they could be killed, that attacked in swarms too numerous to count, that knew no fear and accepted no surrender. The Akir and Troll War, as it would later be known, lasted for centuries. Eventually, the combined might of the troll empires managed to defeat Kithix and scatter the Akir. But the cost had been tremendous. The great troll empires, which had ruled unchallenged for thousands of years, were forever weakened, and the Akir, though defeated, had scattered to the corners of the world. In the southern deserts, they became the Chiraji, who would later threaten Azeroth during the War of the Shifting Sands. In the northern wastes, they became the Nerubians, who would build their great empire of Azj-Nerub beneath the frozen tundra. In the lands that would later be called Pandaria, they became the Mantid, who would serve the old god Yashar's remnants for millennia to come. Xal'atath had achieved her first major influence on the world since her imprisonment. Through Xando, she had set in motion events that would echo through history for tens of thousands of years. The troll empires would never recover their former glory. The Akir would continue to threaten Azeroth in various forms until modern times, and she had done it all while remaining safely hidden within her blade, letting others take the risks while she reaped the benefits of the chaos she had sown. The blade's journey continued through the ages. At some point, following the Great Sundering, when the ancient continent of Kalimdor was torn apart by the implosion of the Well of Eternity, the blade fell into the possession of the Naga. The Naga were once the Highborn, the elite caste of Night Elf society who had served Queen Ashara in her magnificent palace. When Ashara had attempted to summon the Dark Titan Sargeras into Azeroth, using the Well of Eternity as a conduit for his arrival, the other Night Elves had risen up against her. In the cataclysm that followed, the Well of Eternity had imploded, shattering the ancient continent and drowning much of it beneath the sea. The Highborn who survived should have died in the floods. But N'Zoth, the deep god who slumbered in the ocean depths, saw opportunity in their desperation. He offered them survival, transformation, power beyond what they had known as elves. In exchange, they would serve him. Ashara, proud as ever, accepted the bargain. She and her people were transformed into the Naga, serpentine creatures of the deep who would serve N'Zoth's purposes for 10,000 years. How the blade came into Naga possession was never clearly recorded. Perhaps it had fallen into the sea during the Sundering and been recovered by Naga explorers. Perhaps N'Zoth himself had guided it to his new servants, recognizing the potential usefulness of the entity trapped within. Perhaps Xal'atath had somehow influenced events to bring herself into the hands of beings she believed she could manipulate. Whatever the case, the Naga kept the blade for thousands of years, using it in rituals and ceremonies that were never observed by surface dwellers. Xal'atath spent millennia in the depths of the ocean, surrounded by servants of the very old god who had helped imprison her. She was patient, as always. She watched. She learned. She waited for the moment when the blade would move on to its next wielder. What whispers she shared with Naga sorcerers during those millennia has been lost to history. The Naga were not known for keeping written records that outsiders could access, and their oral traditions were never shared with the surface races. But the blade's influence on them would prove significant in events yet to come, particularly in Xal'atath's later dealings with Queen Ashara herself. Millennia passed. Empires rose and fell. The Night Elves established their civilization, lost their immortality, and watched as other races came to prominence across Azeroth. Humans emerged from their primitive tribes to build kingdoms. Dwarves delved deep into the earth, and in the midst of all this change, the blade of the Black Empire continued its patient journey through history, surfacing whenever Xal'atath saw an opportunity to spread chaos. One of the most significant chapters in the blade's history came during the War of the Three Hammers, a devastating civil war that tore apart the unified dwarven kingdom of Ironforge. Three great clans, the Bronzebeards, the Wildhammers, and the Dark Irons, had lived together in relative peace for generations. But the death of High King Modimus Anvilmar without a clear successor led to conflict over who would rule the United Kingdom. The war that followed was brutal and destructive. The Bronzebeards eventually claimed Ironforge itself, driving the other two clans into exile. The Wildhammers retreated to the highlands of what would later be called the Hinterlands, and the Dark Irons, led by the sorcerer Thane Thorasan, retreated to the Redridge Mountains, where they founded a new city. Thorasan's wife, Modgud, was a powerful sorceress in her own right. How she came to possess the blade of the Black Empire is unclear. Perhaps the Naga traded it away, or perhaps it was stolen. Perhaps Xal'atath herself guided events to ensure the blade found its way into the hands of someone who could use it effectively. Whatever the case, Modgud became the blade's wielder during one of the bloodiest conflicts in Dwarven history. While Thaurissan led his forces against the Bronzebeards in Ironforge, Modgud marched against the Wildhammers in grim battle. She brought with her the power of the blade, and with it she brought the shadows themselves to life. The siege of Grim Battle was a nightmare for the Wildhammer defenders. Modgud used the blade's power to animate the darkness, to turn the very shadows into weapons against her enemies. The Wildhammer warriors found themselves fighting not just dark iron soldiers, but living darkness itself, creatures of shadow that could not be killed by conventional means. Grim Battle, the ancestral home of the Wildhammer clan, was corrupted by Modgud's dark magic. The shadows she summoned seeped into the very stones of the fortress, tainting it so thoroughly that the Wildhammers would eventually be forced to abandon it entirely. The corruption was so complete that to this day, thousands of years later, Grim Battle remains a place of darkness and evil, never fully cleansed of the taint that Modgud and the blade brought to it. But even as Modgud seemed on the verge of victory, the blade betrayed her. This was Xal'atath's way. She would grant power to those who served her, would help them achieve their immediate goals, but she would never allow anyone to truly control her. When Modgud needed the blade most, in her final confrontation with the Wildhammer Thane Cardros Wildhammer, it abandoned her. Cardros had fought his way through Modgud's shadow army, had cut down dark iron warriors by the score, and now faced the dark sorceress herself. Modgud reached for the blade to defend herself, to unleash one final burst of shadow magic that would destroy her enemy. But the blade was not there. It had simply vanished, disappearing at the moment of its wielder's greatest need. Modgud fell to Cardros's hammer, and as she lay dying, her final words were a bitter accusation. "You promised." She died still not understanding that the blade had never been her ally, that Xal'atath had simply used her as a tool, discarding her when she was no longer useful. The War of the Three Hammers ended in tragedy for all three clans. Thaurissan, in his desperation, accidentally summoned Ragnaros the Fire Lord from his prison in the elemental plane, destroying his own city and enslaving his people to the Fire Lord's will. The Wildhammers were forced to abandon their tainted home at Grim Battle, and the Bronzebeards, though they kept Ironforge, had lost countless lives in a war that left all dwarves diminished. Through it all, Xal'atath had achieved exactly what she wanted. She had spread chaos and destruction, had corrupted an ancient stronghold, had manipulated powerful beings into serving her ends. And when those beings were no longer useful, she had simply moved on, waiting for the next opportunity to further her mysterious goals. The blade continued its journey through history, always finding its way into the hands of those who could be corrupted, manipulated, or destroyed. During the first war between the Horde and the humans of Stormwind, the blade was used by the orcs in their bloody rituals. The warlocks of the Shadow Council wielded it in dark ceremonies, never realizing that the entity within was studying them just as much as they were using its power. Xal'atath learned orcish shadow magic, incorporated it into her own repertoire of knowledge, and waited for the blade to move on to its next victim. But perhaps no wielder was more significant than Natalie Celine, a bishop of the Church of the Holy Light, who would become the founder of Shadow Priesthood itself. Her encounter with the blade would change the spiritual landscape of Azeroth forever, creating a tradition that would endure long after her death. Natalie Celine lived during the First War, when the Orcish horde poured through the dark portal and invaded the human kingdoms of Azeroth. She witnessed the brutal conflict that followed, saw her people slaughtered by green-skinned invaders wielding strange and terrible magics. The horde's warlocks commanded powers that the priests of the light had never encountered, shadow magic that seemed to mock everything the church taught about the nature of good and evil. Unlike many of her fellow priests who simply prayed for the light's protection, Celine believed that to defeat the orcs, humanity needed to understand their dark powers. Prayer alone would not stop a warlock's curse. Faith alone would not protect against shadow magic. If humans were to survive, they needed to learn what they faced and find ways to counter it. After the First War ended with the destruction of Stormwind and the retreat of its survivors, Celine began her research in earnest. She traveled to battlefields where Orcish warlocks had performed their dark rituals, studied the residual energies left behind, spoke with survivors who had witnessed the horde's shadow magic firsthand. She was searching for any advantage that might help humanity survive the inevitable second conflict. In her investigations, Celine learned of an otherworldly blade that the orcs had once used in their bloody rituals, a dagger that was said to hold sway over the shadows themselves. She tracked down this blade, following rumors and whispers until at last she held the blade of the Black Empire in her hands. The moment she touched it, a name spoke itself in her mind, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once: Xal'atath. Celine knew immediately that this was no ordinary weapon. The voice that spoke to her was ancient, knowing, and utterly alien. She should have destroyed the blade then and there, should have thrown it into the deepest ocean or locked it away where no one could ever find it. But Xal'atath was patient, and her whispers were seductive. She did not try to corrupt Celine immediately. Instead, she offered knowledge. The blade taught Celine that there was more to the universe than the light that the church worshipped. There was also the void, a force equally powerful and equally fundamental to existence. In the balance between these two cosmic forces, one could find power and knowledge beyond anything the church had ever revealed to its followers. One could walk the line between light and shadow, drawing power from both sides without being consumed by either. This was revolutionary thinking for a bishop of the light. The church taught that the holy light was the source of all that was good, that shadow was merely its absence, a thing to be feared and avoided. But Xal'atath showed Celine a different perspective. She revealed that light and void were two sides of the same cosmic coin, that neither could exist without the other, that a true master of spiritual power must understand both. By the time of the Second War, Celine had learned to wield shadow magic alongside her command of the light. She had shared her discoveries with other priests who were willing to listen, had gathered a following of those who saw wisdom in her teachings. Together they fought against the horde in secret, using powers that would have horrified their fellow clergy. Celine taught her followers to be careful, to maintain their balance, to never let the shadow consume them. She understood that the power Xal'atath offered was dangerous, that it could corrupt those who wielded it carelessly. She walked a razor's edge, using dark powers for noble purposes, fighting monsters with the tools of monsters while trying to remain human herself. But Xal'atath was patient, and her whispers never ceased. Night after night, the blade spoke to Selene, revealing secrets of the void, teaching her techniques of shadow magic, slowly wearing away at her resistance. The bishop became obsessed with understanding the mysteries that Xal'atath revealed, spending more and more time studying the blade and less time tending to her spiritual duties. Her followers noticed the change. Some grew concerned that their teacher was straying too far from the light. Others became jealous of the power she wielded, wondering why she did not share all that the blade had taught her. The faction that Selene had built began to fracture, its members turning against each other as suspicion and ambition corrupted their original purpose. Xal'atath encouraged this division. She whispered to Selene's followers in their dreams, planting seeds of resentment and jealousy. She convinced them that Selene was holding back knowledge and power, that she was using them for her own purposes while keeping the blade's greatest secrets for herself. The entity within the dagger was orchestrating a betrayal, just as she had betrayed Modgud, just as she would betray so many others in the ages to come. One night, the conspirators acted. They crept into Selene's chambers while she slept and murdered her in her bed. They took the blade for themselves, believing that now they would have access to all the power that Selene had been hiding from them. But they soon discovered that Xal'atath was not so easily commanded, and without Selene's discipline and understanding, they were quickly consumed by the very powers they sought to wield. Natalie Selene died, but her legacy endured. Despite the efforts of the Kirin Tor to suppress her teachings, her philosophy of balancing light and shadow survived. Her writings were copied and hidden, passed from one seeker of forbidden knowledge to another, preserved by those who recognized the wisdom in her approach. In the years that followed, others would rediscover her writings and take up her practice. Priests who felt constrained by the Church's orthodoxy found liberation in Selene's teachings. Those who had experienced the darkness of the world and found that pure light was not enough to survive discovered in shadow magic a tool for protection and survival. The Forsaken, when they emerged as a people following the fall of Lordaeron to the Scourge, found particular meaning in Selene's teachings. These were beings who had died and been raised as undead, who had broken free from the Lich King's control to find themselves trapped in rotting bodies, rejected by their former allies, hated and feared by the living. The pure light that the Church preached caused them physical pain to channel. They needed a different path. They established the cult of forgotten shadows, a philosophy that embraced the balance between light and void that Selene had championed. For the Forsaken, shadow magic was not corruption, but liberation. It allowed them to wield spiritual power without the agony that the light caused them. It gave them a philosophy that accepted what they had become rather than condemning them for their undead existence. The principles Selene had developed, refined through her communion with Xal'atath, became the foundation of shadow priesthood as practiced in modern Azeroth. Every shadow priest who walks the line between light and void is, in some sense, a spiritual descendant of Natalie Selene. And every shadow priest who has wielded the blade of the Black Empire has repeated unknowingly the journey that Selene first undertook centuries ago. The blade itself passed into the hands of various cults and dark powers over the following centuries. Each time, Xal'atath learned from her wielders, absorbed their knowledge, refined her understanding of the world. Each wielder believed they were using the blade for their own purposes. None of them realized that they were being studied, evaluated, and ultimately discarded when they had served their purpose. The Twilight's Hammer, a doomsday cult that worshipped the old gods, eventually claimed it. This cult had been founded during the Second War by the orc shaman Cho'Gall, who had been corrupted by the old gods and now worked to bring about the end of all things. Under Cho'Gall's leadership, the Twilight's Hammer grew from a minor faction into a significant threat, infiltrating governments, corrupting leaders, and working to free the old gods from their prisons. Through their rituals and sacrifices, the Twilight's Hammer kept the blade fed with power. They performed dark ceremonies in hidden temples, offering blood and souls to the entity within, never realizing that Xal'atath viewed them with contempt. These cultists worshipped the old gods who had imprisoned her. They were tools at best, obstacles at worst. She tolerated their devotion because it served her purposes, but she was simply biding her time, waiting for the perfect opportunity to break free and pursue her own agenda. The blade's moment of greatest power came during the third invasion of the Burning Legion. When demons poured out of the tomb of Sargeras and threatened to consume all of Azeroth, the heroes of the Alliance and Horde were desperate for any weapons that might turn the tide. Ancient artifacts of tremendous power were sought out and claimed by champions of every class and calling. Warriors took up legendary blades, paladins claimed hammers of holy light, mages found staffs of arcane might, and for shadow priests, there was no artifact more powerful than Xal'atath, Blade of the Black Empire. The weapon that had corrupted grim battle, that had awakened Kithix, that had founded shadow priesthood itself, the blade that contained one of the most ancient and dangerous entities in all of Azeroth. The blade was in the possession of Twilight Deacon Farthing when the shadow priests came for it. Farthing was a devoted cultist of the Twilight's Hammer, the doomsday cult that had long worshipped the old gods and worked toward Azeroth's destruction. He had traveled to Tyr's tomb in Tirisfal Glades, intending to use the blade's power to revive Zakai's the Corruptor, an ancient servant of the old gods who had lain dormant since the fall of the Black Empire. The Shadow Priest, who would become the blade's new champion, tracked Farthing through Tirisfal's haunted forests, following the trail of madness and death that the cultist left in his wake. They found him in the depths of Tyr's tomb, surrounded by his followers, already beginning the ritual that would awaken Zakai's. The battle that followed was fierce, but the Shadow Priest emerged victorious. Farthing fell, his followers scattered, and the blade of the Black Empire passed to a new wielder. For the first time in millennia, Xal'atath was wielded by someone who could truly draw upon her full power. The Shadow Priest who carried her was no cultist offering petty sacrifices, no sorcerer seeking personal gain. This was a champion of Azeroth itself, a hero who had already proven themselves in battles against threats that would have destroyed lesser beings. They were fighting to save the world from demonic annihilation, wielding the power of the void against the forces of Fel. The irony was not lost on Xal'atath. She, an agent of the Void, was being used to fight against the Burning Legion, the very force that the fallen Titan Sargeras had created specifically to destroy the Void's influence in the cosmos. Sargeras had witnessed the Void's corruption on other worlds, had seen what happened when old gods succeeded in creating Void Titans, and had decided that all life in the universe must be purged rather than risk such an outcome. Now his legion was being fought with void power itself, shadow magic that had originated with the very entities he sought to destroy. During this time, Xal'atath was not merely a weapon. She was a companion, a voice that whispered to her wielder during their adventures. Unlike other artifact weapons, which were merely powerful objects, the blade was sentient, offering commentary on the events unfolding around them, sharing tidbits of ancient knowledge and occasionally hinting at her own mysterious goals. Shadow priests who wielded her reported hearing her voice constantly, a presence in their minds that was alternately comforting and disturbing. Her whispers came at all hours, in all places. During the quiet moments between battles, she would share observations about the world around them. During combat, she would comment on their enemies, revealing weaknesses and secrets that helped her wielder triumph. During the lonely watches of the night, when the shadow priest stood guard over sleeping comrades, she would speak of ancient times and forgotten places, weaving tales of ages past that made the hours fly by. The whispers she shared were fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. She spoke of the old gods with a mixture of contempt and respect, revealing secrets about their nature that few mortals had ever learned. She discussed the rivalries between them, the schemes and counter-schemes that had played out over millennia, the petty jealousies that existed even among beings of cosmic power. She hinted at her own history with them, at the attack on Ny'alotha that had led to her imprisonment, though she was careful never to reveal too much. She commented on the Naru, beings of pure light that opposed the void, with surprising insight that suggested a far more complex relationship than simple opposition. "I know the Naru consider us horrors to be resisted," she told her wielder. "We do not share this view. They are merely beloved brethren that lost the true path." This comment hinted at the cosmic truth that light and void were not truly opposites, but rather two aspects of the same fundamental force, separated at the beginning of creation. When the Shadow Priest traveled to new locations, Xal'atath would often recognize places and beings that should have been unknown to any entity imprisoned in a dagger for millennia. She knew the secrets of the broken shore where the Legion had first invaded. She knew the history of Suramar, the ancient night elf city that had been hidden for 10,000 years. She knew the names of beings that had been dead since before the Sundering. She recognized powerful beings and artifacts from ages past, offering cryptic observations about their true nature and hidden purposes. When encountering servants of the old gods, she showed a possessive jealousy, calling them idiotic pustules and expressing eagerness to claim their power for herself. These were beings who should have been her allies, servants of the same cosmic force she represented. But Xal'atath saw them as rivals, as obstacles to her own ambitions, as resources to be consumed rather than allies to be cultivated. When facing the Burning Legion, she was strangely philosophical. "The Legion has always been wrong about us," she observed. "They think we want to destroy creation. We do not. We simply want to improve it. This distinction between destruction and transformation was central to understanding Xal'atath's worldview. She did not seek the end of all things, as the Void Lords supposedly did. She sought power, dominion, the reshaping of reality according to her will. Her whispers painted a picture of an entity who had been watching the world for millennia, who knew secrets that even the Titans had never uncovered. She spoke of the Pantheon with a mixture of disdain and grudging respect. She commented on the cosmic forces that shaped the universe, light and void, order and disorder, life and death, as though she had personal experience with all of them. Most disturbing of all were her comments about the world soul of Azeroth itself. She spoke of the nascent titan with a hunger that was almost physical, describing its power in terms that made clear just how valuable a prize it represented. She dreams, Xal'atath whispered once, speaking of Azeroth, and in her dreams, she shapes reality. Imagine what could be done with such power if it were properly directed. The implication was clear. Xal'atath had designs on Azeroth's world soul, plans that went far beyond anything her wielder could have imagined. The campaign against the Burning Legion took the Shadow Priest and the Blade across Azeroth, and eventually to Argus itself, the homeworld of the Eridar and the seat of the Burning Legion's power. The journey to Argus was unprecedented in the history of the mortal races. For the first time, the champions of Azeroth were taking the fight directly to the heart of their ancient enemy, traveling across the cosmos on a Draenei vessel called the Vindikar, powered by light technology that the Naru had shared with their allies. It was here, on the shattered world that the Legion called home, that Xal'atath witnessed something that would prove significant for events to come, the transformation of Alleria Windrunner. Alleria was a legend among the High Elves. The eldest of the famous Windrunner sisters, she had been one of Quel'Thas's greatest rangers, a hero of the Second War who had led her people against the Orcish horde. When the Dark Portal had been destroyed at the end of that conflict, she and a band of Alliance soldiers had chosen to pursue the Orcs through the portal before it closed, stranding themselves on Draenor to continue the fight. For nearly 1,000 years from her perspective, trapped in the twisting nether with the shattered remnants of Draenor, Alleria had fought the Burning Legion as a member of the Army of the Light. The Draenei who led this army had taken her in, had taught her new ways to fight, had shown her that the war against the Legion extended far beyond any single world. During that time, she had encountered the Void and learned to harness its power. This was a dangerous path for anyone to walk, doubly so for someone who fought alongside beings of pure light. The Naru who led the army of the light had warned her that the void was corruption, that it would consume her if she let it in. But Alleria had seen the power it offered and believed she could use it without being controlled by it. Her mentor in these matters had been Locus-walker, the Ka'arishi scholar who had survived the destruction of his world millennia ago. He taught her to channel void energy, to hear the whispers without being driven mad by them, to walk the line between power and corruption. It was a path that few had ever successfully walked, and fewer still had survived. On Argus, Alleria encountered Lura, a Naru who had fallen to the void. The Naru were beings of pure light, but they existed in a cycle of transformation. When a Naru died, It sometimes became a void entity, a dark mirror of its former self. Lura had been captured by the Legion and allowed to undergo this transformation, becoming a creature of darkness that radiated corruption. When Ilaria absorbed Lura's essence into herself, she completed her own transformation. She became something new, something that had never existed before, an elf who wielded both light and void, who had taken the power of a fallen Naru into her very soul, who could exist in both worlds without belonging truly to either. Xal'atath watched this transformation with hungry interest. "The caterpillar has become the butterfly," she whispered to her wielder. "She is all but ours now." The blade recognized Ilaria as something special, someone who had embraced the void without being consumed by it, someone who could hear the whispers and not be driven mad. This made her dangerous, but it also made her potentially useful. In Xal'atath's long-term plans, Illyria Windrunner might yet have a role to play. The campaign on Argus ended with the defeat of the Burning Legion and the imprisonment of Sargeras, the Dark Titan who had led the demonic forces for millennia. The final battle had taken place in the seat of the Pantheon itself, where the champions of Azeroth had faced Argus the Unmaker, a corrupted world soul that Sargeras had twisted into a weapon against them. When Argus fell, the Titans of the Pantheon had used the last of their power to chain Sargeras forever, trapping him at the heart of the seat. But Sargeras had one final act of spite. In the moment before his imprisonment became complete, he plunged his massive sword into Azeroth itself. The blade, larger than mountains, drove deep into the planet's surface in Xal'atath, releasing waves of dark energy that threatened to corrupt and destroy the world soul that Sargeras had failed to claim. It was a tremendous victory for the forces of Azeroth, but it came at tremendous cost. The sword's corruption spread through the planet, poisoning the land, killing wildlife, spreading madness among those who ventured too close. Something had to be done to contain the threat before it consumed everything. The champions of Azeroth turned to their artifact weapons, the powerful relics they had wielded throughout the Legion campaign. These artifacts contained tremendous power, energy that had been accumulated through countless battles and sacrifices. The champions discovered that by channeling this energy into the wound Sargeras had created, they could neutralize the corruption, seal the threat, and save the world soul from destruction. The ritual worked. The artifacts poured their accumulated power into the wound, creating a seal that would hold back the corruption. Azeroth was saved, but the artifacts themselves were drained, their magical reservoirs emptied, their enhanced capabilities lost. For most weapons, this simply meant a return to dormancy. The legendary blades and hammers and staves became ordinary, if still powerful, weapons. Their wielders mourned the loss of power, but accepted it as the price of saving the world. For Xal'atath, it meant opportunity. With the power drained from the blade, Xal'atath was no longer bound as tightly to her prison. The chains that had held her for millennia had weakened, their enchantments fading along with the artifact's power. She had spent ages waiting for this moment, watching through her wielder's eyes as the world changed around her, biding her time for the opportunity that had now arrived. She was not about to let it pass, but she needed help to fully free herself. The bonds that held her essence within the dagger were ancient and complex, woven by the old gods themselves during the height of their power. Even weakened, they could not be broken by Xal'atath alone. She needed someone with the power to sever those final connections, someone who understood the nature of old god magic. She turned to an old enemy who had become a potential ally, in Zoth. All the old gods in Zoth had always been the most like Xal'atath herself. While Yisharj had ruled through overwhelming force, and Sethun had spread madness through direct corruption, and Yogg-Saron had broken minds through whispered manipulation, and Zoth had preferred subtlety. The deep god worked through schemes that unfolded over millennia, through dreams that planted ideas in sleeping minds, through pawns who never realized they were being used. The deep god had been stirring in his prison for some time. Even bound beneath the ocean floor, his influence reached out into the world. He whispered to those who dreamed too deeply. He corrupted those who sought power too eagerly. He planted visions of a future where the Black Empire rose again, where the old gods walked free, where reality itself bent to their will. Now, with Azeroth weakened from the war against the Legion, and Zoth sensed that his moment was approaching. The seals that held him were cracking. The Titan Forged who had maintained his prison for millennia were gone or corrupted. All he needed was a catalyst, a series of events that would weaken his bonds enough for him to break free. Xal'atath reached out to end Zoth through the void, her consciousness flowing through the shadows that connected all things touched by darkness. She proposed a bargain, a simple exchange that would benefit them both. She would help him accomplish his immediate goals, would serve as his agent in the world above his prison, would work to weaken the barriers that held him. In exchange, he would use his power to sever the bonds that tied her essence to the blade. And Zoth agreed, though he certainly had his own hidden agenda. The deep god never did anything without multiple purposes, never made a deal without ensuring that he would profit, regardless of how events unfolded. He saw in Xal'atath a useful tool, one that could be discarded or claimed depending on how circumstances developed. He did not trust her, and she did not trust him. But for the moment, their interests aligned. The bargain was struck in whispers and shadows, sealed with promises that neither party truly intended to keep. The bargain played out through the events leading up to the Crucible of Storms, a raid instance that took place beneath the precipice of oblivion in Stormsong Valley. Xal'atath guided an adventurer to discover a Azj-kahet medallion, an artifact connected to Queen Azshara and her Naga servants. This medallion led to a questline that would change Xal'atath's existence forever. Through the blade's guidance, the adventurer learned that the Naga were attempting to conjure a storm powerful enough to scour all of Azeroth. To do this, they needed 3 relics: the Voidstone, the Trident of Deep Ocean, and the Tempest Caller. Xal'atath directed her pawn to collect these artifacts, ostensibly to stop the Naga's plan. The first relic, the Voidstone, was in the possession of a high elf named Inanis who had been attempting to wield its power. The adventurer killed Inanis and recovered the stone. But what happened next shocked even those who thought they understood the blade's nature. Xal'atath drew upon the Voidstone's power and used it to possess Inanis's corpse. For the first time in millennia, the entity trapped within the blade had a physical form. She could walk, speak with her own voice, and interact with the world directly rather than through whispers alone. The corpse was a temporary vessel, what players would later call a meat puppet, but it gave Xal'atath freedom of movement she had not enjoyed since the old gods imprisoned her. Now, in her new body, Xal'atath helped the adventurer collect the remaining 2 relics. But rather than using them to stop the Naga, as she had claimed, she brought them to the Crucible of Storms itself and presented them to N'Zoth as an offering. She also offered something else, the adventurer who had trusted her, delivered as a prize to the god of the deep. "I have brought you the opener," she declared, "the bringer of truths, the torch that lights the way." Then, with her part of the bargain fulfilled, she demanded her reward. "Honor our bargain. Free me to find my own fate." N'Zoth kept his word. He severed Xal'atath's consciousness from the blade entirely, releasing her to pursue her own agenda. But the blade itself remained, still potent with residual power. "Go," N'Zoth commanded, "but the blade must remain to serve my will." Xal'atath departed, free for the first time since the old gods had imprisoned her ages ago. She left behind the blade that had been her prison and her home, abandoning it without a second thought. The dagger that bore her name was now simply a tool of N'Zoth, and Xal'atath had other plans. What those plans were, she did not reveal. She simply vanished, slipping into the spaces between realities, beginning her long-delayed schemes for power. For a time, she was invisible to mortal eyes, working in dimensions that most beings could not perceive, gathering power and preparing for the next phase of her existence. The blade she left behind continued its own journey. It found its way to Sylvanas Windrunner, the war chief of the Horde, who had her own mysterious agenda. Sylvanas called it a compass that would guide the Horde to victory, though what victory she sought and how the blade would help achieve it remained unclear. The Banshee Queen was playing her own game, one that would eventually lead to the war against the Alliance and the events that would reshape Azeroth. Sylvanas would later trade the blade to Queen Ashera as part of a bargain whose true terms were never fully revealed. Ashara, the ancient queen of the Naga and one of the most powerful sorceresses in Azeroth's history, had her own uses for an artifact of the old gods. What she did with the blade, whether she still possesses it or has passed it along to others, remains one of the many mysteries surrounding the blade of the Black Empire, but these were just the blade's adventures. Xal'atath herself was embarked on something far more significant. During the events of the Dragonflight expansion, Xal'atath made contact with Iridikron, one of the primal incarnates who had been imprisoned beneath the Dragon Isles for millennia. Iridikron was a servant of the Void who had been waging war against the Titans and their dragon allies since the earliest days of Azeroth's history. He possessed the Dark Heart, an artifact of tremendous power that he had infused with the primal hunger of Galakrond. The arrangement between Xal'atath and Iridikron was simple. He would give her the Dark Heart, and in exchange, she would help him achieve his goals against the dragon aspects. What Iridikron did not realize was that Xal'atath had no intention of truly helping him. She wanted the Dark Heart for her own purposes, and she was willing to make whatever promises were necessary to obtain it. When Iridikron was eventually defeated by the champions of Azeroth, Xal'atath claimed the Dark Heart and disappeared once more. She had what she needed. Now it was time to put her plans into action. Xal'atath was free, and she had much work to do. With her freedom secured, Xal'atath turned her attention to consolidating power for her next great scheme. But to understand her plans, we must first understand her history with Dimensius the All-Devouring, the Void Lord she had once served as Harbinger. Demensius was one of the most terrifying entities in the cosmos, a Void Lord whose hunger knew no limits. He traveled between realities, consuming worlds and devouring their very essence. Entire civilizations were unmade by his passage, their matter and energy absorbed into his endless hunger. For countless ages, Xal'atath had served as his harbinger, the herald who went before him to prepare worlds for consumption. The world of Karish was one such target. Karish was home to the beings who would later become known as Ethereals, a civilization of brilliant scholars and powerful mages who had achieved great heights of knowledge and culture. When Demensius set his sights on Karish, its people had no hope of resisting him directly. The Void Lord's power was simply too great for any mortal civilization to withstand, but Xal'atath, even then, was plotting her escape from Demensius's service. She saw an opportunity in Karish's doom, a chance to break free from her master while also striking a blow against him. She approached certain Ka'arishi scholars, including the being who would later take the name locus-walker, with a proposition. The details of what happened next remained secret for millennia. What the rest of the cosmos believed was that Demensius had consumed Karish, destroying the planet and transforming its inhabitants into the ethereal beings they are today. What actually happened was far more complex. Xal'atath, now working with locus-walker, and another Karishi named Nari, devised a plan to weaponize Karish's destruction. They used the Reshi ribbons, ancient Karishi relics, to channel the planet's death throes into a weapon against Demensius. When Karish was destroyed, the energy released was directed at the Void Lord, dealing him a devastating blow. Demensius did not truly die. Void Lords are not so easily destroyed, but he was severely weakened, forced to retreat and recover for ages. And Xal'atath had achieved her goal. She was freed from his service, no longer bound to herald his consumption of worlds. The survivors of Karish scattered across the cosmos. Some became the Ethereals, beings of pure energy bound in bandages and arcane constructs. Others became the brokers, entrepreneurs who traded goods and services across realities. And a few, like locus-walker, devoted themselves to understanding and mastering the void that had destroyed their home. Locus-walker would go on to become a mentor to others who sought to wield the void responsibly. It was he who taught Ilaria Windrunner to control her void powers, who helped her walk the line between using darkness and being consumed by it. He and Xal'atath had shared a secret for millennia, the truth of what had really happened to Karish. But secrets have a way of coming to light, and Xal'atath's treachery would not remain hidden forever. The entity she had betrayed, Dimensius the All-Devouring, was stirring once more, and when he returned, old alliances would be tested and ancient betrayals would be revealed. When Xal'atath made her dramatic return to the forefront of Azerothian affairs, she did so with a patience and cunning that had been honed over millennia. The War Within expansion of World of Warcraft marked her transformation from a background manipulator to the central antagonist of the Worldsoul Saga. Her first major move was to target the Nerubians of azj-kahet. The Nerubians were an ancient race, descended from the Akir who had served the old gods during the Black Empire. But unlike their Mantid and Chiraji cousins, the Nerubians had long ago rejected the worship of the old gods. They had established their own civilization deep beneath the earth, proud of their independence from the dark powers that had created them. Azj-kahet was the last kingdom of living Nerubians on Azeroth. Unlike the empire of Azjol-Nerub in Northrend, which had been consumed by the Scourge during the war against the Lich King, azj-kahet had remained hidden and untouched. Its people had survived for millennia through isolation, avoiding the conflicts that had destroyed their northern kin. Xal'atath saw the Nerubians as perfect tools for her plans. They were powerful, numerous, and resentful of their long isolation. All she needed was to find the right leverage to bring them under her control. She approached the kingdom's rulers with an offer carefully calculated to appeal to their deepest desires. Queen Neferes sat on the throne of azj-kahet, a monarch who had ruled her people through centuries of hardship and isolation. She had watched her kingdom shrink as the tunnels collapsed and the old territories were abandoned. She had seen her people's numbers dwindle as the resources grew scarce. She had presided over a slow decline that seemed to have no end, no hope, no future. Xal'atath offered her the chance to reverse all of that. She promised to make the kingdom great again, to restore the Nerubians to the power they had wielded during the age of the Black Empire. She painted visions of vast armies marching forth from azj-kahet, of tunnels spreading across the entire underground world, of a Nerubian empire that would rival anything that had come before. All Neferes had to do was accept the gift of the black blood, the corrupting substance of the dead old gods, which would transform her people into beings of tremendous power. Neferes listened to the offer, and for a moment she was tempted. The visions Xal'atath showed her were beautiful in their terrible way, images of strength and glory that any ruler would find appealing. But Neferes was old enough to remember the stories, the tales passed down through generations of what had happened to those who had served the old gods. She remembered that her ancestors had fought and died to free themselves from that slavery, had sacrificed everything to ensure that their descendants would not be tools of cosmic evil. She refused. Her voice was firm, her decision final. The Nerubians of azj-kahet would remain free, would find their own path to survival, would not trade their independence for power offered by entities of the void. Neferes told Xal'atath to leave her kingdom and never return. But Xal'atath had not put all her hopes in one basket. She never did. Even as she made her offer to the queen, she had been studying the court, identifying those who might prove more receptive to her proposals. She had seen the frustration in certain younger Nerubians, the impatience with the old ways, the hunger for something more than slow decline in the darkness. And she had noticed Ansurek. Neferes's daughter was everything her mother was not. Where Neferes was cautious, Ansurek was bold. Where Neferes valued tradition, Ansurek longed for change. Where Neferes saw the old gods as monsters to be rejected, Ansurek saw them as sources of power that her ancestors had been fools to abandon. The young princess had grown up hearing tales of the Black Empire's glory, of the great Nerubian civilization of Azjol-Nerub that had once stretched beneath Northrend before the Scourge had destroyed it. She had wondered what might have been if her ancestors had not rejected the old god's power, if they had remained strong instead of hiding in the darkness like frightened prey. She loved her mother, but she believed Neferes was leading their people to extinction through excessive caution. When Xal'atath came to Ansurek with the same offer she had made to the queen, she found a much more receptive audience. The princess listened eagerly to the visions of power and glory. She asked questions about the black blood and what it could do. She wanted to know how quickly her people could be transformed, how soon they could begin reclaiming the territories they had lost. Xal'atath answered every question patiently, feeding Ansurek's ambition while carefully concealing her own true purposes. She played the role of mentor and advisor, of a powerful ally who only wanted to help the Nerubians achieve their potential. She never mentioned the price that would ultimately be paid, the servitude that would eventually be demanded. By the time Ansurek realized the truth, it would be far too late. The princess's choice led to tragedy. On a night like any other, in the eternal darkness of azj-kahet, Ansurek confronted her mother in the royal chambers. Words were exchanged, arguments that had been building for years finally coming to a head. Neferes tried to convince her daughter that Xal'atath was manipulating her, that the power being offered came with chains attached. Ansurek did not want to hear it. In her mind, her mother's caution was indistinguishable from cowardice. She had made her choice, and she would not let anyone stand in her way. She drew her blade and struck. Neferes fell, the light fading from her ancient eyes, her last sight her own daughter's face, twisted with determination and ambition. Ansurek blamed her mother's death on the Arathi, the human settlers who had recently arrived in the underground realm of Hallowfall. These humans, survivors of some distant catastrophe, had established a small kingdom beneath the great crystal called Beladar. They were innocent of any crime against the Nerubians, but they made convenient scapegoats. Ansurek used this fabricated grievance to justify a war that would serve Xal'atath's purposes, rallying her people against an external enemy while consolidating her own power at home. With Ansurek on the throne, the transformation of azj-kahet began. Nerubians who submitted to the process were infused with black blood, becoming twisted, ascended beings of tremendous power. Those who refused were marginalized, their objections dismissed as the complaints of cowards afraid of change. A resistance movement formed among traditional Nerubians, but Ansurek's forces were too powerful to openly oppose. Xal'atath now had her army. The Nerubians of azj-kahet would serve as the vanguard of her invasion of Azeroth, their void-enhanced abilities making them formidable opponents for even the greatest heroes of the Alliance and Horde. But Ansurek never realized that she was merely a tool. Xal'atath cultivated a false friendship with the young queen, playing the role of mentor and ally, while secretly viewing her as nothing more than a means to an end. When Ansurek reminded Xal'atath of promises she had made, the Harbinger's response was chilling. "I promised nothing, yet still I gave you everything." Xal'atath had no loyalty to her pawns. She never had. From Zondo to Modgud to Natalie Celine to Ansurek, every wielder and every ally had been used and discarded when they were no longer useful. This pattern would continue as her plans unfolded. The destruction of Dalaran was perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of Xal'atath's power and ruthlessness. For thousands of years, the floating city had been a symbol of arcane might, a testament to what mortals could achieve when they dedicated themselves to the pursuit of magical knowledge. The Kirin Tor, The Council of Archmages who governed the city had protected Azeroth through countless crises. They had fought against the Scourge. They had opposed the Burning Legion. They had been a bulwark against evil for generation after generation. Dalaran itself was a marvel of magical engineering. The entire city floated upon currents of arcane energy, suspended above the world, protected by wards that had taken centuries to perfect. Its libraries contained knowledge accumulated since the founding of the human kingdoms, tomes of power that could not be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. Its population included some of the most powerful mages in Azeroth's history, men and women who had dedicated their lives to understanding and wielding the arcane. When the Council of Six decided to relocate Dalaran from above the Broken Isles to the Isle of Dorn, they believed they were moving to a safer position. The Broken Isles had been contested territory during the Legion invasion, and the Council wanted their city positioned closer to the emerging threats in the north. They had no idea they were walking into a trap that had been years in the making. Xal'atath had been planning this moment for some time. She had infiltrated Dalaran using multiple disguises, wearing what she called skin suits to walk among the mages undetected. These were bodies she had claimed and puppeted, mortals whose minds she had consumed, whose forms she wore like clothing. She moved through the city's streets, attended its academic lectures, dined in its restaurants, and no one suspected that the person beside them was actually an ancient entity of the void wearing mortal flesh. One of her personas was Archmage Drendon, a former member of the council who had been missing for years. The real Drendon was long dead, his soul consumed, his body preserved through dark magic to serve as Xal'atath's vessel. In this guise, she learned the city's defenses from the inside. She studied its magical infrastructure, identified weaknesses in its wards, mapped the flows of arcane energy that kept it aloft. She attended council meetings, read classified reports, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. The moment came when Dalaran materialized above the Isle of Dorn. Before the mages could react, hordes of Nerubians attacked, swarming the city in numbers too great to repel. The Council of Six rallied their forces, believing this was simply an assault they could weather. They had survived countless attacks over the centuries. What was one more? But the Nerubian assault was merely a distraction. While the city's defenders focused on repelling the invaders, Xal'atath herself began siphoning the arcane energy that kept Dalaran afloat. The city was powered by tremendous magical force, energy that had been accumulated and refined over generations. This power was exactly what Xal'atath needed to feed her dark heart, the artifact that Iridikron had given her during the events of Dragonflight. Khadgar, the leader of the Kirin Tor and one of the most powerful mages in Azeroth's history, confronted her directly. He was aged now, his hair white and his face lined with the weight of countless battles, but he was still formidable, still one of the most powerful spellcasters Azeroth had ever produced. He had served as guardian of Tirisfal in all but name. He had stood against Medivh, against the Burning Legion, against threats that would have destroyed lesser mages. He recognized that this was not an ordinary attack, that the stakes were far higher than mere conquest. The confrontation between Khadgar and Xal'atath was a clash of philosophies as much as power. Khadgar represented everything the Kirin Tor stood for: the responsible use of magic, the protection of knowledge, the defense of Azeroth against those who would misuse arcane power. Xal'atath represented the antithesis of these values. Power seized without regard for consequences, knowledge hoarded and weaponized, the subjugation of all creation to a single will. This city is home to such power, Xal'atath told him, her voice carrying the weight of ages, all squandered by the Kirin Tor. You have had millennia to shape this world, and what have you accomplished? You hide in your floating city, debating a theory while the cosmos burns around you. I will put this power to much better use. Khadgar's response was a spell of tremendous force, arcane energy gathered from decades of study and practice, channeled through a staff that had been wielded by some of the greatest mages in history. The attack should have destroyed anything it touched. Against Xal'atath, it barely made her pause. She was too powerful now. The dark heart had absorbed too much energy. Khadgar was facing an entity that had been gathering strength for millennia, that had consumed the essence of beings far more powerful than any mortal mage. He fought bravely, his magic blazing against the encroaching darkness, but it was not enough. It could never have been enough. Xal'atath unleashed the Dark Heart's full force, channeling void energy through the city's arcane infrastructure. She had spent years studying how Dalaran worked, understanding the flows of magic that kept it aloft. Now she used that knowledge to tear the city apart from within. Dalaran began to crumble, its spires falling, its towers collapsing, its magical protections failing one after another. In his final moments, before the city's destruction, Khadgar spoke to Alaria Windrunner, who had also come to oppose Xal'atath. They stood together on a crumbling platform, void energy swirling around them, the city dying beneath their feet. Khadgar looked at Alaria with eyes that held no fear, only determination and a warning. This isn't the real fight, he said, recognizing that even this devastating attack was merely one step in a larger plan. Xal'atath was gathering power, absorbing essences, preparing for something greater. Dalaran's destruction was just at the beginning. Remember that. Whatever comes next, remember that this isn't the real fight. Then the void energy consumed everything. Dalaran disappeared in a supernova of dark energy. The proud city that had floated above Azeroth for so long was simply gone, reduced to rubble that rained down on the ground below. Most assumed that Khadgar had died in the explosion, his long life finally ended by Xal'atath's treachery. But Khadgar, even in that moment of apparent defeat, had managed to survive. At the last instant, he transformed himself into pure energy, hoping to escape the destruction. Instead, he was absorbed by the Dark Heart, becoming trapped inside the very artifact that had powered the city's destruction. He would remain there, weakened and suffering, until events later in the expansion allowed him to emerge. When he finally did, it was as a broken man, confined to a wheelchair by the damage he had sustained. Xal'atath had not killed him, but she had destroyed much of what made him Khadgar, his strength, his mobility, his certainty in his own power. The destruction of Dalaran served multiple purposes for Xal'atath. It demonstrated her power to the world, making clear that she was a threat unlike any Azeroth had faced before. It eliminated one of the most powerful, organized magical forces on the planet. It fed tremendous arcane energy into the Dark Heart, adding to the various essences she was collecting. And it demoralized her enemies, showing them that even their greatest strongholds were not safe from her reach. With Dalaran gone and its defenders scattered, Xal'atath turned her attention to the next phase of her plan. The underground realm of Algar became the primary battleground for the war within. Here, beneath the surface of the world, in caverns that stretched for thousands of miles, in darkness that had never known the touch of sunlight, Xal'atath gathered her forces and continued to expand her power while the heroes of Azeroth struggled to oppose her. Algar was a realm of wonders and horrors. The dwarven city of Dornogal served as the main entry point for surface dwellers, a bastion of civilization carved into the living rock. Below that lay the ringing deeps, vast chambers where earthen constructs had toiled for millennia, mining ore and maintaining titan machinery whose purpose had long been forgotten. Further still was Hallowfall, an underground realm lit by Beladar, a massive crystal that alternated between states of light and void on a regular cycle, bathing the lands below in its radiance. And at the deepest point, where the darkness was most complete and the whispers of the void were loudest, lay azj-kahet, the kingdom of the Nerubians, who had sworn themselves to Xal'atath's service. The Dark Heart was the key to her plans. This artifact had a long and terrible history of its own. Originally created by the dragon Nelthurion during the age before his corruption, when he was still the Earth Warder and protector of Azeroth's mountains and caverns, the Dark Heart had been designed to contain and focus elemental earth energy. But Nelthurion had fallen to the whispers of the old gods, had become Deathwing the Destroyer, and his creations had been twisted to dark purposes. The Dark Heart passed through many hands over the millennia before eventually coming into the possession of Iridikron, one of the primal incarnates who had opposed the Titans during the ancient past of the Dragon Isles. Iridikron had empowered the artifact with the primal hunger of Galakrond, the great proto-dragon whose corpse still lay frozen in Northrend. Galakrond had been a monster beyond imagining, a proto-dragon who had grown so large and so hungry that he had threatened to consume all other dragonkind. His hunger was eternal, insatiable, and now that hunger lived within the Dark Heart. The artifact had the unique ability to absorb different types of magical energy and convert them into shadow power. It was hungry, always hungry, and Xal'atath was feeding it well. Xal'atath was collecting essences, drawing power from various sources to feed the Dark Heart's growing hunger. She'd already claimed the arcane energy of Dalaran, sought the black blood of the old gods that pooled beneath azj-kahet. She had her eyes on Beladar, the great crystal that hung above Hallowfall, which alternated between states of light and void. But her most significant acquisition would come when she confronted her old master, Demensius the All-Devouring. The Void Lord had been recovering from the wounds dealt to him during the destruction of Kaarish. Now, after millennia of gathering his strength, he was preparing to return. His servants, the Shadow Guard, had obtained the Dark Heart and intended to use it to revive their master to his full power. This presented Xal'atath with both a threat and an opportunity. If Demensius returned at full strength, he would almost certainly seek to reclaim her as his Harbinger. She had betrayed him once, and Void Lords do not forget. But if she could defeat Demensius while he was still weakened, she could absorb his essence into the Dark Heart, claiming his power for herself. Gates. Unlikely alliance formed. Locus-walker, who had his own reasons to fear Demensius's return, reached out to Illyria Windrunner and the champions of Azeroth. They would need to stop the Shadow Guard before they could complete their ritual, and to do this, they would need Xal'atath's help. Alleria was understandably reluctant to work with the entity who had destroyed Dalaran and killed countless innocents, but locus-walker convinced her that they had no choice. Demensius was a greater threat than Xal'atath, at least in the short term. Once the Void Lord was dealt with, they could focus on stopping the Harbinger. Xal'atath played along, pretending to be a reluctant ally against a common enemy. She provided information about the Shadow Guard's plans, helped coordinate the assault on their stronghold, and fought alongside the heroes of Azeroth against the forces trying to revive Demensius. The truth about Karesh came out during this alliance. Alleria learned that it had not been Demensius alone who had destroyed locus-walker's homeworld, but a conspiracy involving Xal'atath herself. Locus-walker admitted that he had been part of the plan, that he had chosen to destroy his own world rather than let it be consumed by the Void Lord. It was the only way, locus-walker insisted. Demensius would have devoured Karesh completely. At least this way, some of us survived. But Alleria could not accept this justification. She had trusted locus-walker as a mentor, had believed that he was teaching her to use the void responsibly. Learning that he had been part of a conspiracy to destroy an entire world shattered that trust. She cast aside her ribbon, the symbol of their connection, and declared that she would never trust him again. This division between Alleria and locus-walker was exactly what Xal'atath wanted. The fewer allies her enemies had, the easier they would be to defeat. The confrontation with Demensius came at last in a place between realities, Nexus Point, where the barriers between dimensions had grown thin enough for the Void Lord to begin manifesting. The entity had been partially revived by his Shadow Guard servants, his hunger awakening, even as his full power remained out of reach. He was still weak by the standards of Void Lords, still recovering from the wounds dealt to him during Kaarish's destruction millennia ago. But even a weakened Void Lord was a threat beyond anything most mortals had ever faced. The heroes of Azeroth, aided by Xal'atath and the remaining Kareshi allies, fought to prevent Demensius's complete restoration. The battle took place across multiple planes of existence simultaneously, warriors fighting in the physical world, while void energies clashed in dimensions beyond mortal perception. Demensius was hunger incarnate, his very presence draining life and energy from everything around him, and the champions struggled just to survive in his vicinity. Locus-walker led the assault from the Kareshi side, using techniques he had developed over millennia of studying the void. He knew Demensius better than anyone alive, had spent ages preparing for this confrontation, had dedicated his entire existence to ensuring that the monster who had consumed his world would be stopped. Now, at last, he would see whether his preparations had been enough. Xal'atath played her part, using the Dark Heart to absorb and redirect the void energies that Demensius unleashed. She appeared to be a loyal ally, fighting alongside the heroes, working to contain the Void Lord rather than allow him to escape. Those who did not know her history might have believed she was genuinely committed to Demensius's defeat. The battle was fierce, lasting hours that felt like days. Warriors fell and rose again. Mages exhausted themselves casting spell after spell. Priests called upon every reserve of light and shadow they possessed. And slowly, inexorably, the tide turned against Demensius. When the final blow was struck, the Void Lord's essence collapsed inward, drawn toward the dark heart that Xal'atath held aloft. The artifact absorbed his power, containing the entity that had consumed worlds within its depths. For a moment, it seemed like a victory. Dimensius the All-Devouring was contained, his hunger finally ended, and Azeroth was safe from his terrible power. Then Xal'atath revealed her true intentions. She turned on locus-walker with a speed that left no time for reaction. The being who had been her co-conspirator millennia ago, who had kept her secrets all this time, who had trusted that their alliance still held meaning, found himself facing the dark heart's full power. "You always knew this was coming," Xal'atath told him, as void energy began tearing at his essence. "We are creatures of the void. Betrayal is our nature." Locus-walker tried to fight back, tried to use the techniques he had developed over millennia to resist. But the dark heart was too powerful now, bloated with Demensius's essence, hungry for more. It pulled at locus-walker's being, drawing him in piece by piece, consuming the Karishi scholar who had survived the destruction of his world, only to meet his end at the hands of his former ally. In his final moments, locus-walker called out to Ilaria, trying to warn her about something, to share some final piece of knowledge that might help her understand what Xal'atath truly sought. But his words were lost in the howl of the void, consumed along with his essence, leaving only silence where a being of immense knowledge and power had once stood. With locus-walker dead and Demensius contained within the dark heart, Xal'atath possessed more power than she had ever wielded before. The artifact pulsed with energy, its hunger temporarily sated, but already beginning to demand more. She smiled, a cold expression that reached nowhere near her eyes, and disappeared before Ilaria could stop her. The elf warrior was left standing in the aftermath of battle, surrounded by the bodies of fallen allies, staring at the empty space where Xal'atath had been. She had lost her mentor, the being who had taught her to harness the void, who had saved her from being consumed by its power. She had learned that he had lied to her for years, that he had been part of a conspiracy that had destroyed his own world, and she had watched helplessly as Xal'atath escaped with more power than ever before. Ilaria swore to hunt the Harbinger down. She would find Xal'atath no matter how long it took. She would avenge locus-walker despite his betrayals. She would stop Xal'atath before she could complete whatever grand design she was working toward. This was no longer just a battle for Azeroth. This was personal. The hunt would continue across the underground realms of Khaz-Algar, through the Nerubian kingdom of azj-kahet, into the depths where even the bravest heroes feared to tread. But Xal'atath was always one step ahead, always anticipating her pursuers' moves, always laying traps and misdirections that slowed them down while she pursued her own mysterious objectives. The revelations about Xal'atath's true nature continued to unfold as the Worldsoul Saga progressed. In patch 11.1.7, players experienced a lore-walking questline that provided new insight into the Harbinger's origins and imprisonment. The Lore Walkers were a Pandaren organization dedicated to preserving and understanding history, and their archives contained knowledge of events that most of Azeroth had long forgotten. Through magical visions of the past, players witnessed the moment when the four old gods turned against Xal'atath. The cutscene was rendered in the distinctive style of the Lore Walkers' historical records. showing events that had occurred during the age of the Black Empire, tens of thousands of years before the rise of the mortal races. It depicted Sethun, Yogg-Saron, N'Zoth, and Y'Sharj coming together in a rare moment of cooperation, setting aside their eternal rivalries to deal with a common threat. The scene showed Xal'atath's attack on Neolotha, her forces pushing into N'Zoth's nightmare city, threatening to claim its power for herself. For a moment, it seemed as though she might succeed, but then the other old gods arrived, their combined might overwhelming her armies, their power crushing her resistance. The four greatest servants of the Void Lords, who had spent ages scheming against each other, had united against this upstart who had dared to challenge their dominion. Most significantly, the vision showed Xal'atath in a form different from either her current humanoid appearance or the monstrous shapes of the old gods. She appeared as what players called a void wrath, a more primitive entity of pure void energy. Her form was indistinct, shifting and changing from moment to moment, a being of shadow and malevolence that had not yet learned to take on a fixed shape. This visual distinction emphasized that Xal'atath was not an old god, despite theories to the contrary, but something else entirely. Something perhaps older, perhaps more fundamental to the nature of the void itself. Y'Sharj's taunts during the imprisonment gave further insight into the old god's perspective on their rival. The greatest of the old gods loomed over her defeated form, his 7 heads that speaking in a chorus of mockery and contempt. He told her that she would only be able to watch as the old gods claimed Azeroth's power for themselves. She would be a spectator to their triumph, never able to act on her own ambitions. She would see the world soul corrupted, would witness the birth of a void titan, would know that everything she had hoped to achieve was accomplished by others, while she remained trapped in her prison. But Xal'atath's response was defiant, even in defeat. Her voice, though weakened, carried the conviction of a being who had already survived countless setbacks across the ages. "This game has only just begun," she declared. "I have an eternity to play." The old gods had underestimated her patience. They had looked at her defeat and assumed that it was final, that she would remain trapped forever in the prison they had crafted. They imprisoned her in the blade of the Black Empire, a sacrificial dagger that had been used in the darkest rituals of their nightmare civilization, confident that she would never escape. But they could not foresee the chain of events that would eventually lead to her freedom. They could not know that the Titans would come and imprison them in turn, that the Black Empire would fall and their power would be diminished. They could not predict the wars that would weaken the barriers between dimensions, the mortals who would rise to challenge cosmic powers, the champions who would wield Xal'atath's blade without understanding what lurked within. And they certainly could not anticipate that N'Zoth, in his own schemes for freedom, would make a bargain that would release their ancient rival from her prison. The vision ended with Xal'atath being sealed within the blade, her consciousness trapped but not destroyed, her patience beginning its millennia-long wait. The players who witnessed this vision came away with a new understanding of who Xal'atath was and what drove her. She was not simply another villain seeking power. She was a being who had been denied her destiny, who had been imprisoned by those she considered her equals, who had waited thousands of years for the chance to prove that her defeat was only temporary. Xal'atath had waited millennia for her revenge. Now, with the old gods dead or imprisoned, with the blade that had held her abandoned, with power flowing into her dark heart from multiple sources, she was finally in a position to claim what she had always believed was rightfully hers. The question that remained was what exactly she intended to do with that power. The dark heart had already absorbed arcane energy from Dalaran, black blood from beneath azj-kahet, the essence of Demensius, and the power of locus-walker. What more did she need? What was her ultimate goal? The answer lay in the Worldsoul Saga's overarching narrative. Xal'atath was collecting different types of cosmic energy, different essences that represented the fundamental forces of the universe. She had claimed order from Dalaran, void from Demensius, death from Galakron's hunger that already infused the dark heart. What remained were the powers of light, life, and perhaps others. The Sunwell, the great font of light energy that sustained the blood elves and high elves of Quel'Thalas, would be an obvious target for an entity seeking to absorb light energy. And indeed, the next expansion in the Worldsoul Saga, Midnight, would take place in and around the Elven Kingdoms, with Xal'atath's forces invading Quel'Danas in an attempt to claim the Sunwell for themselves. But Xal'atath's plans extended beyond mere power accumulation. She had spoken of using the Dark Heart to pry Azeroth from the Titan's grasp, suggesting that she intended to free the World Soul from the influence of the Titans who had ordered it. Whether this meant corrupting Azeroth to the void, or something else entirely, remained to be seen. What was clear was that Xal'atath would remain a threat throughout the Worldsoul Saga. She was not a one-expansion villain who would be defeated and forgotten. She was a cosmic entity with plans that spanned millennia, patience that rivaled the old gods themselves, and power that was still growing with each essence she consumed. As the events of the war within continued to unfold, shadow priests who had wielded Xal'atath during the Legion expansion found themselves in a unique position. These were the champions who had carried the blade of the Black Empire across battlefields from Azeroth to Argus, who had heard her whispers in their minds for months of combat, who had shared an intimacy of thought and purpose that few beings could truly understand. When confronting the Harbinger during the campaign finale, Xal'atath recognized them. Her eyes, those pools of void energy that seemed to see through flesh and bone into the very soul, fixed upon them with an intensity that was almost intimate. She remembered the time they had spent together, the battles they had fought, the secrets they had shared in the quiet hours between conflicts. She addressed them differently than she addressed other heroes, her voice taking on a tone that was almost affectionate. "Yes, bring your allies to me, my blade," she whispered to those who had been her wielders. "Drive them to the brink, for you have become the weapon that I now wield." These words revealed a disturbing truth that chilled even the most experienced of shadow priests. Xal'atath viewed her former wielders not as opponents to be defeated, but as tools she had shaped during their time together. All those whispers during the Legion campaign, all those secrets shared in the depths of night, all those moments of apparent companionship had served a purpose she had never revealed. She had planted seeds in their minds that she believed would bear fruit when she needed them. The shadow priests who heard these words felt a cold fear that had nothing to do with the battle around them. They remembered the whispers, remembered how natural it had felt to listen to them, how easy it had been to accept Xal'atath's guidance. They had believed themselves to be in control, wielding the blade as a tool against their enemies. Now they understood that the relationship had been far more complex than they had realized. Perhaps they had never truly been in control at all. Whether this was mere psychological manipulation or a genuine magical influence remained unclear. Shadow priests had long walked the line between using void power and being consumed by it. They heard whispers constantly, voices from the spaces between realities that urged them toward darkness. They had learned to filter these voices, to use the power without being controlled by it. But Xal'atath's whispers had been different. They had been specific, personal, tailored to each individual wielder. They had offered knowledge and insight rather than simple corruption. Xal'atath's whispers might have tilted them further toward the darkness than they realized. Perhaps during all those months of combat, she had been subtly reshaping their thoughts, adjusting their perceptions, preparing them for a moment that had now arrived. Perhaps every secret she had shared had been calculated to create exactly the response she wanted when she finally confronted them as an enemy. Or she might simply be trying to unsettle them, to make them doubt themselves at a critical moment. Xal'atath was a master of psychological manipulation, and sowing doubt in the minds of opponents was a tactic she had employed countless times across the ages. Perhaps there was no deep corruption, no hidden influence. Perhaps she simply wanted them to hesitate, to second-guess themselves, to wonder if they were truly in control of their own actions. The truth likely lay somewhere between these extremes. Xal'atath was nothing if not thorough. She would have taken advantage of every opportunity to influence those who wielded her, but she would not have relied solely on that influence. She always had multiple plans, multiple paths to victory. If the shadow priests proved resistant to her manipulations, she would find another way to achieve her goals. The relationship between Xal'atath and her former wielders exemplified her approach to everyone she encountered. She saw all beings as potential tools, pawns to be used and discarded when they had served their purpose. She formed what appeared to be personal connections, shared secrets and confidences, cultivated trust and even affection. But beneath it all, there was only calculation, only the cold assessment of how each relationship could serve her ultimate goals. Every smile was strategic. Every confidence was a manipulation. Every moment of apparent connection was actually an investment in future betrayal. Queen Ansorek had believed herself to be Xal'atath's friend and ally. She had betrayed her own mother, transformed her people, and waged war on the innocent Arathi settlers of Hallowfall, all because she thought Xal'atath was helping her achieve greatness. In the end, she was nothing more than a means to an end, her kingdom merely a source of soldiers for the Harbinger's army. Locus-walker had been Xal'atath's co-conspirator for millennia, had kept her secrets, had worked alongside her against Demensius. In the end, she killed him without hesitation, consuming his essence to add to her growing power. Even N'Zoth, the old god who had freed her from the blade, was likely just another pawn in her long game. She had used him to escape her prison, knowing that he believed he was using her for his own purposes. When N'Zoth was defeated during the battle for Azeroth, Xal'atath was already pursuing her own agenda, unconcerned with the fate of her one-time benefactor. This pattern suggested that there was no one Xal'atath would not betray, no ally she would not sacrifice, no oath she would not break if it served her purposes. She was utterly alone in the cosmos, connected to no one, loyal to nothing but her own ambition. The road ahead for Xal'atath stretched across multiple expansions and countless conflicts. The Worldsoul Saga was designed as a trilogy of connected stories, with Xal'atath serving as the through-line villain who would be confronted multiple times before the final reckoning. In Midnight, the second expansion of the saga, players would travel to the elven kingdoms of Xal'atath to defend the Sunwell against Xal'atath's invasion. The Sunwell was one of the most powerful sources of magical energy in all of Azeroth, a font of pure light that had sustained the High Elves for thousands of years. When Prince Arthas had defiled it during the Third War, using its power to resurrect the necromancer Kel'Thuzad, the elves had nearly been destroyed by the loss. They had survived only by changing their name, their identity, becoming blood elves in honor of their fallen kin. The Sunwell had eventually been restored, reignited with the essence of Anaru, becoming a source of both arcane and light energy. Now it represented exactly the kind of power that Xal'atath sought to feed into her dark heart. The forces of the Void, led by what had been called the Devouring Host, would assault the Blood Elf and High Elf homelands in an attempt to claim this light energy and add it to the collection of essences that Xal'atath was gathering. This confrontation would bring together the scattered elven peoples of Azeroth, peoples who had been divided for thousands of years by war, ideology, and circumstance. Blood elves who had nearly fallen to addiction to fey magic. High elves who had clung to their traditions despite exile from Silvermoon. Void elves who had embraced the very power that Xal'atath wielded, transforming themselves into something new and frightening. Night elves who had lost their beloved Teldrassil to the fires of war. All of these would need to unite against a common threat, setting aside ancient divisions in the face of annihilation. The expansion would explore themes of reunion and reconciliation, of family members separated for generations finally coming together, of old wounds being healed even as new ones were inflicted. The Windrunner sisters, Alaria, Sylvanas, and Varisa, each represented a different path that the elves had taken since the fall of Quel'Thalas. Their reunion and reconciliation would mirror the broader themes of the expansion. Alaria Windrunner would play a central role in this conflict. Her connection to the Void made her uniquely suited to oppose Xal'atath, for she understood the power that the Harbinger wielded in ways that no other being alive could claim. She had walked in the Void herself, had heard its whispers, had nearly been consumed by its darkness. She had learned to use that power without being controlled by it, to walk the line between shadow and light. But her connection to the Void also made her vulnerable. The whispers that all Void elves heard constantly, the background noise of darkness that they had learned to ignore, would intensify in Xal'atath's presence. The Harbinger knew how to speak to those who had touched the Void, knew how to amplify the whispers until they became screams, knew how to turn her enemies' powers against them. Alleria would need to master her abilities completely, would need to achieve a level of control that no Void elf had ever attained if she hoped to stand against the Harbinger who had once tried to claim her as a tool. The third expansion, The Last Titan, would bring the Worldsoul Saga to its conclusion. Details remained scarce, but it was known that the expansion would involve the return of the Titans themselves and the resolution of Azeroth's Worldsoul storyline. The nascent Titan that slumbered within Azeroth's core, the prize that both the old gods and the Void Lords had sought for millennia, would finally awaken or be resolved in some other way. Whether Xal'atath would be defeated in midnight or would continue as a threat into the final expansion remained to be seen. Given her history of surviving seemingly final defeats, of waiting out her enemies and striking again when they believed her contained, it seemed likely that she would remain a presence throughout the saga. She might suffer setbacks, she might lose battles, but complete defeat seemed unlikely for an entity who had already survived imprisonment by the old gods, the fall of the Black Empire, and millennia of being passed between wielders who never understood her true nature. As the last Titan would also need to address the questions that the Worldsoul Saga had raised about the nature of creation itself. The Titans were beings of order, cosmic entities who traveled the universe shaping worlds and nurturing world souls. They had ordered Azeroth, had imprisoned the old gods, had left behind guardians to maintain their work. But they had also failed to detect Xal'atath's threat, had allowed her blade to pass unnoticed through their ordered world for millennia. What would happen when the Titans returned to find that their carefully ordered creation was under assault by an entity they had never anticipated? What would they think of the mortal races who had risen in their absence, who had defeated threats that the Titans themselves had failed to contain? And what role would Xal'atath play in the confrontation between order and void that seemed to be building toward a climax? These questions would drive the narrative forward, promising a conclusion that would reshape the very nature of Azeroth and its place in the cosmos. What was certain was that Xal'atath had achieved more in her time as an antagonist than most villains in World of Warcraft's history. She had destroyed one of the game's most iconic locations, reducing the floating city of Dalaran to rubble in a display of power that shocked players who had spent years adventuring within its walls. She had killed beloved characters, ending the life of Khadgar, one of the most enduring figures in the game's history. She had manipulated entire civilizations into serving her purposes, corrupting the Nerubians and using them as her army. And she had done it all while maintaining an air of elegant menace that made her genuinely terrifying. Unlike other villains who raged and threatened and promised destruction, Xal'atath was calm, measured, almost reasonable in her evil. She explained her actions, offered opportunities for surrender, seemed genuinely puzzled when her enemies refused to see the wisdom of her path. This calm made her more frightening than any amount of monstrous roaring could have achieved. The blade that had once held her prisoner was now just a transmog option for players who remembered wielding it in Legion. But the entity who had inhabited that blade was free, powerful, and pursuing goals that threatened all of Azeroth. Xal'atath had waited millennia for this moment. She was not about to let it slip away. The story of Xal'atath is still being written. As of the current content in World of Warcraft, she remains at large, empowered by the essences she has absorbed, pursued by Alaria, and other heroes who seek to stop her before she can complete her mysterious plan. The dark heart grows stronger with each essence it consumes, and Xal'atath shows no signs of slowing her campaign of conquest and consumption. What does she truly seek? What is the end goal of all her scheming, all her collection of essences, all her careful manipulation of events? The answer remains hidden, known perhaps only to Xal'atath herself. But we can speculate based on what we know of her history and her nature. She has spoken of using the dark heart to pry Azeroth from the Titan's grasp. This suggests that she seeks to break the Titan's hold on the world soul, to free it from the ordering that the Pantheon imposed millennia ago. Whether this means corrupting the world soul to the void, or claiming it for herself, or achieving some entirely different outcome, remains unclear. Some have theorized that Xal'atath seeks to become an old god herself. She was denied this status by the four who imprisoned her, was told that she would never be one of them. Perhaps she has spent millennia planning to prove them wrong, to accumulate enough power to transform herself into something equal to or greater than the beings who humiliated her. Others believe she serves the Void Lords still, despite her history of betrayal. Perhaps her apparent independence is itself a deception, a role she plays to advance the Void Lord's agenda while appearing to pursue her own goals. The Void is, after all, deception incarnate. What better agent than one who appears to have broken free from servitude? And still others think that Xal'atath seeks something beyond even the Void Lord's comprehension. She has existed for so long, has seen so much, has accumulated knowledge that spans the breadth of creation. Perhaps she has glimpsed truths that even cosmic entities have not perceived. Perhaps she pursues a destiny that transcends the simple categories of order and void, light and shadow. Whatever her ultimate goal, the path there runs through Azeroth. The world soul at the planet's core is the key to her plans, the prize that makes all her scheming worthwhile. Everything she has done, from the destruction of Dalaran, to the corruption of the Nerubians, to the collection of essences for the dark heart, serves this purpose. She is building towards something, preparing for a moment that has not yet arrived. The forces arrayed against her are formidable. Ilaria Windrunner, perhaps the only being alive who truly understands the Void's power and how to resist it, has sworn to hunt Xal'atath down no matter how long it takes. Ilaria has walked in the Void herself, has heard its whispers, has nearly been consumed by its power. She knows the temptations that Xal'atath offers, knows how seductive the darkness can be, and she has overcome those temptations, has learned to use the Void without being controlled by it. If anyone can match Xal'atath in understanding of shadow magic, it is Ilaria Windrunner. The remnants of the Kirin Tor, shattered but not destroyed by Dalaran's fall, work to counter her magical machinations. These mages have lost their home, their leader, their certainty, but they have not lost their knowledge or their determination. They rebuild in the shadows, studying Xal'atath's magic, searching for weaknesses, preparing for the day when they can strike back against the entity who destroyed everything they had built. The various factions of the Alliance and Horde, despite their differences, recognize that Xal'atath represents a threat to all mortal life on Azeroth. The old conflicts between the factions seem petty in the face of an enemy who would consume the world itself. Leaders who once plotted against each other now share intelligence and coordinate strategies. Soldiers who once fought on opposite sides now train together for battles to come. The threat of Xal'atath may yet achieve what decades of diplomacy could not, genuine unity among the mortal races of Azeroth. But Xal'atath has been hunted before, she has been opposed before, she has even been defeated and imprisoned before, and yet she endures, she adapts, she waits for the moment when her enemies let down their guard, when they believe she has been contained, and then she strikes again with all the patience and cunning that millennia of existence have granted her. What makes Xal'atath such a compelling villain is her patience and her perspective. She has witnessed the rise and fall of empires that modern historians have never heard of. She has seen gods imprisoned and freed, has watched as seemingly insurmountable powers were ultimately overcome. She was ancient when the trolls built their first cities. She was ancient when the night elves discovered the well of eternity. She was ancient when the titans themselves first came to Azeroth. Nothing shocks her. Nothing surprises her. She has seen it all before, across countless worlds and countless ages. This long view gives her a detachment that other villains lack. She does not rage against her enemies or monologue about her grievances. She does not seek revenge for its own sake or allow emotion to cloud her judgment. She simply acts, confident that her plans will eventually succeed because she has the time to wait for the perfect opportunity. If one scheme fails, she will simply devise another. If one pawn is lost, she will find another. If one path is blocked, she will take another route. Time means nothing to her, and that makes her terrifying in ways that more immediate threats are not. Consider the Lich King, once the greatest threat Azeroth had ever faced. He was defeated within a few years of his emergence as a power. Consider Deathwing, the Worldbreaker, who nearly destroyed Azeroth during the Cataclysm. He too was defeated, his madness ultimately proving his undoing. Even the old gods themselves, ancient and terrible as they were, have been killed or imprisoned, their schemes unraveled by the combined might of Azeroth's champions. But Xal'atath remains. She has outlasted them all. She watched from within her blade as each great threat rose and fell, and she learned from their mistakes. She would not be so direct as the Lich King, would not be so obvious as Deathwing, would not be so predictable as the old gods. She would work in shadows, would cultivate patience, would strike only when victory was assured. Her relationship with the void itself remains somewhat mysterious. Is she an agent of the Void Lords, working to prepare Azeroth for their eventual consumption? Or is she pursuing her own agenda, using void power without being truly subservient to it? The answer may be more complex than a simple binary. Xal'atath has betrayed every master she has ever served. There is no reason to believe she would be any more loyal to the Void Lords themselves. Perhaps she is truly alone, an entity whose only goal is her own power and survival. Perhaps she sees in Azeroth's world soul something that could elevate her to new heights of existence. Perhaps she simply wants to prove that she was right, that she should have been an old god, that the beings who imprisoned her made a mistake they will regret for eternity. Whatever her ultimate motivation, Xal'atath has established herself as one of the most dangerous villains in World of Warcraft's history. She has the power to destroy cities and kill archmages. She has the cunning to manipulate civilizations and turn allies against each other. and she has the patience to wait for the exact right moment to strike. Consider the scope of what she has already accomplished since breaking free from her blade. She has corrupted an entire kingdom of Nerubians, turning them into her willing soldiers. She has destroyed Dalaran, one of the most powerful magical institutions in Azeroth's history. She has absorbed the essence of a Void Lord, claiming power that few beings in the cosmos could hope to match. She has killed her former ally without hesitation, demonstrating that no relationship, no matter how long-standing, will protect anyone from her ambitions. And she has done all of this while remaining largely hidden, working through proxies and pawns, revealing herself only when she chooses to be seen. The heroes who oppose her rarely know where she is or what she is planning until it is too late to stop her. They react to her moves rather than anticipating them. They clean up the damage she leaves behind rather than preventing it in the first place. This is the advantage of patience. This is what millennia of planning and observation have granted her. She knows how heroes think because she has watched them for ages. She knows how armies move because she has seen countless campaigns unfold. She knows how to manipulate hope and fear, how to exploit division, how to turn strength into weakness. She has studied every race, every faction, every power structure on Azeroth, and she uses that knowledge with devastating effect. The heroes of Azeroth will need to be at their best to stop her. They will need to set aside their divisions, to work together across faction lines, to use every resource at their disposal. The Alliance and Horde have spent decades fighting each other, their conflicts weakening both sides, while threats like Xal'atath watched and waited. Now they must find common cause against an enemy who exploits division, who feeds on conflict, who grows stronger every time mortal races turn against each other instead of facing the true threats. And even then, victory is not guaranteed. Xal'atath has been planning for millennia. She has contingencies for her contingencies. If one scheme fails, she has another ready. If one path is blocked, she finds another route. She has already demonstrated that she is willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to achieve her goals. Her pawns die by the thousands, and she does not care. Her allies are betrayed when they become inconvenient, and she feels no remorse. She is utterly ruthless, utterly focused, utterly devoted to her own advancement. The Worldsoul Saga is not just about stopping an invasion or defeating a villain. It is about confronting an entity who has been watching and waiting since before recorded history began. It is about facing a darkness that is patient, intelligent, and utterly without mercy. It is about proving that the mortal races of Azeroth can overcome even the most ancient and cunning of enemies. Azeroth has faced cosmic threats before. The Burning Legion invaded 3 times and was ultimately defeated. First during the War of the Ancients, when the Night Elves sacrificed their civilization to prevent Sargeras from entering the world. Then during the Third War, when the combined forces of Azeroth stood together at Mount Hyjal and stopped the Legion's advance at the cost of the Night Elves' immortality. And finally, during the Legion expansion itself, when the champions of Azeroth traveled to Argus and defeated the Legion at the heart of their power. The old gods schemed for millennia and were ultimately imprisoned or destroyed. Sethune awakened during the War of the Shifting Sands and was defeated by the champions who breached the gates of Ankh-Kiraj. Yogg-Saron was confronted in Ulduar and sealed away once more. Y'Shaarj's remnants were cleansed from Pandaria after causing untold suffering through the Shah, and N'Zoth, the last of the old gods, was finally destroyed during the assault on Ny'alotha, his corruption purged from Azeroth through the combined might of champions wielding the power of the Titans themselves. Deathwing tried to tear the world apart and was ultimately brought down by the combined might of the mortal races and the dragon aspects. The cataclysm he caused reshaped the face of Azeroth, destroying cities and sundering continents. But even this ultimate expression of destruction was not enough to overcome the heroes who opposed him. They pursued him to the maelstrom, to the very heart of the world, and there they ended his madness forever. Time and again, when all seemed lost, the heroes of Azeroth have found a way to prevail. This is the nature of the world that Xal'atath seeks to claim. It breeds and champions. It creates heroes. It refuses to surrender, no matter how desperate the odds. But Xal'atath is different from all the threats that have come before. She has watched as each great villain made their play for power and failed. She has analyzed their strategies, identified their mistakes, and taken careful note of how they were brought down. The Burning Legion was ultimately defeated because of Sargeras's obsession with Azeroth's world soul. He could not simply destroy the planet from afar. He had to possess it, to claim it, to corrupt it himself. This obsession gave the defenders of Azeroth time to organize, to find allies, to develop strategies for resistance. Xal'atath would not make the same mistake. She had no interest in personal glory or cosmic ideology. She wanted power, and she would pursue it by whatever means proved most effective. Deathwing was defeated because his madness made him predictable. The whispers of the old gods had driven him insane, and insanity is ultimately a weakness. He could not adapt, could not change his approach, could not recognize when his plans were failing. Xal'atath was entirely sane, cold and calculating, capable of adjusting her strategies in response to changing circumstances. The old gods were defeated because they underestimated the mortal races. They saw the brief-lived beings of Azeroth as insects, as pawns, as resources to be exploited. They could not conceive that such fleeting creatures might possess the power to challenge entities who had existed since before the ordering of the world. Xal'atath knew better. She had watched these mortals for millennia. She had seen them overcome threats that should have destroyed them. She respected their capacity for heroism, even as she worked to ensure that heroism would not save them this time. She would not be so arrogant as the Burning Legion. She would not be so mad as Deathwing. She would not be so contemptuous as the old gods. She would be patient. She would be careful. She would strike only when victory was assured. And if her first plan failed, she would have others ready. If her first pawns were destroyed, she would have more. If her first approach was blocked, she would find another route. This is what makes Xal'atath unique among the villains of Azeroth's long history. She is not driven by rage or madness or cosmic ideology. She is driven by pure, calculated ambition. Every action serves a purpose. Every sacrifice advances a goal. Every betrayal moves her closer to victory. There is no emotion to exploit, no weakness of character to manipulate, no moment of doubt that might give her enemies an opening. The heroes who oppose her face not just a powerful enemy, but an intelligent one. They cannot simply fight harder or gather more allies or find a legendary weapon that will solve everything. They must outthink an entity who has been outthinking her opponents since before their species evolved. They must outplan someone who has been planning since before the ordering of the world. Some may say that such a task is impossible, that no mortal creature can truly match the cunning of an ancient void entity, that the best the heroes of Azeroth can hope for is to delay the inevitable. But the history of Azeroth suggests otherwise. Time and again, mortal heroes have achieved the impossible. They have defeated beings who should have been invincible. They have overcome odds that should have been insurmountable. They have proven that determination, courage, and unity can triumph over raw power and ancient cunning. Perhaps they will prove it again against Xal'atath. Perhaps the Harbinger of the Void, for all her patience and planning, has underestimated the very mortal spirit that has overcome every other threat to Azeroth. The blade that bore her name was just a prison. Now freed, Xal'atath is showing the world what she was always capable of, and she is far from finished. The Worldsoul Saga continues to unfold. The battles against Xal'atath are far from over. The heroes of Azeroth still stand, still fight, still refuse to surrender, no matter how dark the hour becomes. The story will continue through midnight and the last Titan, through victories and defeats, through hope and despair. And in the end, the fate of Azeroth's world soul and perhaps all of creation will hang in the balance. That is the story of Xal'atath so far. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. As the Worldsoul Saga continues to unfold, so will our coverage of it here on World of Sleepcraft.